passage before, which is rare, but it's actually been kind of fun because I kind of got to dig into it. And so while it is fun to say, and I do enjoy the idea of this idea where Jesus' first miracle is keeping the party going, and it was, there's actually a whole lot more, obviously, going on in this story than that. And so if you locate where we are, we're right at the beginning, we're at John chapter 2, so we're right at the beginning of John's telling of Jesus' ministry. Similar to where we were at last week with the book of Mark. Book of Mark, last week we were in chapter 2. Jesus hadn't done much, if you remember. He'd called a few disciples, and he hadn't really done much stuff yet before he decided to go and eat with the tax collectors and the sinners. Today, in John's telling of the story, we have again this moment where Jesus hasn't done much, but then decides to, however you want to think about it, perform what ends up becoming his first miracle in the book of John. Now, every author of a gospel gets to decide, at some point what goes in the story and what doesn't. And of course, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you remember, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are related, right? You will find exact duplicates of language in all three. They were drawing kind of from the same sources. John is kind of the other one. It's kind of the standout in that it doesn't share much of anything with the other four, or the three. It shares some of the same stories, absolutely, but it doesn't share many of the same passages, and John includes a lot of details that you don't find in the other three. John also leaves out a lot of things that you will find in the other three, which is, by the way, why we have four. Right? And that's why the people who put together the Bible in the first place said, we need all four of these because it's kind of like four different eyewitnesses to the same event, right? They're each going to notice very different details. I was actually an eyewitness to thankfully nobody was hurt, but to a car accident near my church. And I was the only one of the witnesses who could correctly identify the make and the model and the year of the car. It was a 2002 Mitsubishi 3000 GT, FYI. Still, I don't know why I remember that, but I do. But so the different people will notice different things, and different things will be important to them. And so what kind of is interesting in John's Gospels, John leaves out some things. John doesn't have a birth narrative. Jesus just sort of shows up. Only Luke and Matthew have birth narratives. The other thing is John includes John the Baptist as somebody in it. And right before this story, we get the story of John the Baptist talking about Jesus and the coming of Jesus and how important Jesus would be. And he's there. And Jesus and John interact in John's gospel. But the thing that they don't do, that he does not include, is John the Baptist's baptism of Jesus. If you remember early on in the other ones, Jesus is actually baptized by John. John leaves that detail out. And that's sort of an aside, I'm always curious why he chose. I mean, he obviously knew that had happened. But I think part of it is his project here, his telling of the story, we end up with a Jesus who doesn't seem or feel to have much to prove. So in John's story, especially chapter 1 and chapter 2, Jesus sort of shows up and everybody seems to instantly know that this man is important. They seem to instantly know there's something different about him. They seem to almost automatically know who he is in a way. And Jesus doesn't have to prove himself much in John, and which is why I think it's part and parcel of reason why his first miracle is this one. Now, in order to get into this, we're going to have to dig into this a little bit, and I'm going to have to nerd out on you for a little while, but I got a really great story about my grandma at the end, which you're going to love. So hang in there for the nerding out, and then we'll do the story about my grandma. Anyway, so like I said, there's actually a lot going on here. Jesus is at a festival. He's at a wedding. Weddings are a big deal in this time and the place. I mean, weddings are a big deal today as well. But a wedding then really did symbolize really the coming together of two families, the blending of families, the sharing of resources, the expansion of the ability and the wealth oftentimes of families. So especially if you were people who with more means, and not everybody was, but if you were a person with more means, you would probably have a pretty lavish thing going on. And it's also the days, before Facebook and Netflix and all that kind of stuff, where people just didn't have as much to do. right? So getting to go hang out with your friends all day at a wedding and eat good food and drink wine and have a good time, I mean, that was a very attractive proposition, and people liked to show up to those things. So Jesus and his family and some of his disciples get an invitation to this wedding. We're not told who's getting married. That apparently is not important. Poor bride. Your wedding is inscribed in history forever for 2,000 years. 2,000 years later, we're talking about your wedding, and that poor bride, we don't even know her name. But we don't. So we're not told why he's there. We're only told that he's there. And what you can kind of surmise is that people are having a good time, and in fact, maybe more people showed up than were planned for. So something happens, which of course, the thing that happens is the wine runs out. So Jesus' mother, who also coincidentally, interestingly, John never names. John never calls her Mary. We know her name is Mary from the other Gospels, but John doesn't say it. It just says Jesus' mother comes to him and tells them, basically informs him that there is a problem, right? And of course, the problem is that we're out of wine. Now, if you notice, she never asks him to do anything, right? She just comes and presents this problem to Jesus and says, Jesus, there's this problem. And Jesus responds with, that's great, but that's not my problem. He said it nicer than that. But he's like, that's a problem, but it ain't my problem. And then, Jesus' mom, of course, being a good mom and probably knowing who her son is better than anybody else, just simply goes to the stewards and says, again, asks him for nothing, but just then goes to the stewards and says, just do whatever he tells you to do. And she kind of exits the scene. And that's when we get Jesus decide to take action and correct this problem which is going on. Now, interesting enough, we don't get anything about where, whose wedding it is or those kind of details. We do get a detail about where the water jars came from. Now, here's a little thing, especially in the Gospels, but throughout Scripture. If the detail is included, it's important. Right? Details that get included in works that literally were copied by hand for thousands of years, right? Things stick around that mean something. So the fact that John tells us where the jars came from, that they weren't just kind of randomly sitting around, but they were used for the washing ritual, the fact that that detail is included tells us something important about it. One of the things it tells us is that they had them there and they were practicing the hand washing ritual, which basically means this was a wedding that was happening by the numbers. This was a wedding that was following the rules. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot in Jesus' day is they had a lot of rules. A lot of the rules come from the first 5 books of the Bible, but they're not very specific. So along the way, different scholars and rabbis and teachers basically explained the rules. You can kind of think of it like this. You can kind of think the fact that, Congress passes laws, but then there's all those other agencies that make regulations, right? Regulations that are supposedly to enforce the laws. So we have a lot of laws in the Bible without a lot of clarity of how you're actually supposed to practice it. So other people came along and they wrote all the regulations. And if you remember, it's groups like the Pharisees that are really, really into the regulations because they've memorized them all. Right? And so there's regulations for everything, and the more important an event is, and the more significant that it is, the more regulations that tend to go with it. So there's all sorts of rules governing things like weddings, about who has to do what and what has to happen and who gets to do what and who's invited and who isn't, and all these sorts of responsibilities. If you think Bridezilla is bad now, imagine. So one of the regulations was everybody who's coming, if you're going to come to the wedding, you had to be ritually clean, which means you had to wash yourself as you came in. So there would be huge containers of water, as you can see, these huge, kind of like giant vase things with water. And they were there so that you could pull water out and that you could wash your hands and you could make yourself kind of religiously or ritually clean so that you could be there with the bride and groom on their special day. Those are the jars that Jesus asks for. He asks them to be refilled, and then, by some means that only Jesus understands, of course, it's turned into wine. I think one of the things that we are meant to take from this is a lot of symbolism and a lot of metaphor, And I think one of the things that Jesus is showing us in this moment at the very beginning is he's kind of cluing us in. He's giving us a clue as to what Jesus' whole project, whole mission, whole thing is going to be about. Because what Jesus basically does is he takes the water that was designed to be an outward sign of your religiousness and instead turns it into something that is designed to be inside of you. Turns it into something that is not meant, that is no longer meant to keep you okay, ritually or religiously. He's changing it into something that is supposed to develop community, which is supposed to keep people together. He's changing it to something that we hope would bring joy. The truth is, if we look really at what Jesus was about, Jesus really, and what he meant, Jesus actually did not come to transform religion. Jesus came to transform hearts. He came to give us a new way to live that was less about making sure that we were showing all the proper outward signs, that we had the right bumper stickers on our car and the right bookshelves in our thing and the right CDs in our CD player. You young people don't know what CDs are, but Spotify station, right? Whatever. I don't have Spotify. I don't know. Where do you, music? That we're listening to it came to make sure, it didn't come to make sure that we were practicing all those great, wonderful outward signs. But instead, Jesus came to make sure that we had transformed hearts. That we not only had the look of people who were following Jesus, we actually had the love of people who were following Jesus. That's the point of the whole thing. So he transports this thing that's supposed to be an outward sign of your belonging, of being part of the in-group, into something inward, something that goes inside of us, something that changes us there. Now, this was a big deal back then. This idea, all of these rules and stuff had a purpose. They weren't just neat freaks, even though I'm sure that helped in that regard. One of the things that it did is it signaled you were part of the group. If you practiced these things, you were part of the group. And it was basically this forced way you were basically forced to out yourself all the time, wherever you were, because if you were part of the group that was following the rules in a place where people weren't so accustomed to that, you would get noticed that you were acting differently. And that's one of the ways that you showed and shared that you were part of a certain group. Jesus wants to change that. He wants it to be different. He doesn't want our outward signs to be the thing that defines us. He wants it to be something else. He wants it to be how we love. I actually think today Christians need to be a little careful sometimes when we choose to practice our faith in public and obviously. So let me give you my standard rule. I don't have a lot of rules. I don't have a lot of rules. I don't have a lot of rules for you all. But here's a rule that I invite you to all adopt. If you're going to pray, obviously, before your meal at a restaurant, tip well. Honestly. It is well known amongst waitstaff that if you see a group praying before their meal, you're not getting a very good tip from that group. And that's sad. We can fix that one. So if you're going to pray, tip well. If you're going to have a bumper sticker on your car about Jesus, don't cut me off in traffic. These are the rules. There's an interesting thing. So when we come here to worship. One of the things that we want to do, one of the reasons that we do this, right, is to join our hearts together. One of the reasons we do this is to encounter the Holy Spirit. If you've noticed, we don't get hung up on a lot of rules around here. We don't get hung up on a lot of those things because it's not the question we ask ourselves. It's not the question I ask myself. The question I ask myself when it comes to worship and how we decide to do what we do is the question of, is this going to help people grow in their discipleship? Is it going to help them learn to love God, love neighbor, love themselves? Is it going to bring them joy? That's what matters. And that's why I love worship. Now, as I was going through this, I was thinking about those different times and places I've had the opportunity to worship, and I was thinking, for reasons that I'll share later, I was actually been thinking recently about my trip to Angola, which I've talked about a lot. But one of the things that we did, if you're a group of visiting clergy in another country visiting other churches and church people, the one thing they're going to want to do is take you to church. A lot. So it was not uncommon for us to go to church 2 or 3 times, on a Sunday in various places, and everybody wanted to meet us and greet us, which was great. And at first, I must confess, I was a little concerned about this. And I was concerned because I do love worship. I love participating in it. I love leading it. I wouldn't do this if I didn't. And I was concerned because the one thing that is true around Angola is they don't speak English there, believe it or not, right? They speak Portuguese, which, frankly, I don't speak. I took German in high school and not very well. Lowest grades I ever got. And I must confess, I did not learn much more than hello or goodbye, and I'm certain I've forgotten those by now. So I was worried that, we would go to worship and it just wouldn't have that same meaning, and it just wouldn't feel worshipful in that way, because, you wouldn't be able to understand what was going on. I wouldn't be able to hear the words of the prayers, and those sorts of things. But here's what I'm going to tell you that I discovered, is that joy sounds like joy no matter what language it's in. And once you figure out what the Portuguese word for Jesus is, you can typically follow along. And at least when we're blessed to be in Methodist churches, the tunes to the hymns don't change. I was actually having a bit of a moment because I remember. So this is the First Church in Melange. This is actually on the grounds of kind of the head of the whole conference. The bishop's office is across the way. It's the biggest church there, and it didn't matter that this amazing, beautiful choir was singing in a language I did not understand. It stirred the soul. It was awesome. And actually, at this service, I remember I was trying to remember what it is that we sang, and I remembered it just this morning because one of the things we sang was Blessed Assurance. And I got to tell you, when you're singing Blessed Assurance in English with a bunch of other people singing it in Portuguese, it is fantastic. I don't know why I was worried, because as it turns out, it's not about necessarily the words, which is hard for somebody who gives words for a living to say. But it turns out in that moment, in that place, it really wasn't about the words. It was about being in a room full of people and being around people who were having an encounter of the Holy Spirit. It was being in a community that obviously cared for each other. They laughed together and they cried together. It was being in a community that clearly wanted to be there together, because otherwise, why would they have sat through their 2-hour worship service? You're thankful it's only an hour here. But it was joy-filled, and it was wonderful, and I began to look forward to and be excited by the worships we would going to. And while I thought that this one, with its large congregation and big choir and all the stuff, would be the high water mark, I discovered it was not. When we got out into more of the rural churches where there's only 30 or 40 people at best gathering in a little room, the joy that you found in that room was every bit, if not more, palpable, because those folks loved being around each other. It didn't matter that I didn't quite understand what they were saying. It didn't matter that I didn't know the rituals. It didn't matter that I didn't know when to stand up and sit down and what I was supposed to do when I was supposed to do it, because it wasn't about that. Frankly, it really wasn't about the religion. It was about the heart. It was about the grace. It was about the love. And as long as I was in that space and they were in that space, we couldn't help but be there together. And that's the way things work. Though sometimes we may find ourselves in a position where we don't understand what's going on, it does not mean, and should not mean, that we cannot find joy in that situation. All right, so recently I saw on Facebook that some wonderful, delightful person has arranged for a classic animated movie of 1986 to come back to theaters for a couple of days. And of course, I'm talking about Transformers the movie, because it's amazing. All right. So here's my story about this movie. So this came out in 1986. I was an avid watcher of the TV show. I had many of the toys that I wish I still had that I foolishly got rid of because I'm an idiot. And I remember playing Transformers outside, like on this hill thing outside my grade school. And I remember going to school the next day to talk about what it was before. This was a big deal in my life at the time. So when I found out they were actually making a movie out of it, this was the first time in my life I'd ever realized, oh, people make movies for me. right? I thought adults made movies for adults. We all had to just go, right? Because the adults wanted to go. And I'm like, oh, this one's for me. This is my movie. I get to go. Now, oddly, my older sister was not very interested in this, as you can imagine. And my younger brother was just too young. He didn't quite get it either. He didn't watch it with me. And so I really, really wanted to go. And I'm not entirely certain how it happened, but somehow my grandmother got to be the one to take me to see this movie. And I remember going to like the multiplex at the mall and getting the popcorn and the whole 9 yards. And I remember sitting there in the theater and getting ready to watch this thing. And it came on and the thing, and I was like super excited. Now, there will be some spoilers for Transformers the movie coming up. So if you don't want to hear them, you don't care. It doesn't matter. So we get it. Now, if you know this movie, you know something crazy shocking happens in the first 10 minutes. So for 2 years, I had watched this cartoon, right, and with the same characters over and over and over again, and nothing really changes. Some characters may get added, but nothing bad ever really happens to any of the characters in a Saturday morning cartoon, right? And it was true for this show. Nothing bad ever happened to the good guys. For some reason, they would shoot at each other all day and not hit a thing, right? I mean, it was just that kind of thing. So in the first 10 minutes of the show, when the bad guys come on the scene and actually kill like 4 of the good guys, my like 9-year-old brain exploded. I'm like, that's not how this works. And I remember my grandma looking over at me, and I can see her face in my mind right now. She looks over at me because I'm obviously upset. And she's like, are you okay? And I'm like, Grandma, oh my gosh. And she's like, what are you talking about? And so I started trying to explain to her, like in the middle of the movie, like who this is and who that is and why that's a good guy and that's a bad guy and why it's sad and all this sort of stuff. And she just has this look of like confusion and concern to the point that it's burned into my like, I think 8 or 9 years old, however I was, consciousness. I can still picture this face that she made. And she actually asked, like, do you want to go? And I'm like, no. I have to see what happens. And of course you do, and the good guys win at the end. If you need a redeeming attribute, by the way, of Transformers the movie, it is actually Orson Welles' last credited role before he died. That's kind of sad. Sad for Orson, unfortunately, but it is. He played a voice in this, and he's actually his last credited role. Anyway, and what's funny is, funny is years later, 2 things happened years later. One is I got a copy of it on DVD that had the director's commentary, where he talked about the fact that he got hate mail from 7-year-olds. And frankly, he was so callous and indifferent about it, I never wanted to watch another one of his movies again. So mad. But then this became one of those stories that would come up in the family. Right? About every 3 or 4 years, we would be in some kind of conversation. I'd be there with my grandma, and she would bring up taking me to this movie. And she would talk about it over, she's like, oh, yeah, remember that time you took me to the movie? I had no idea what was going on, and she would chuckle and laugh. And I remember a couple times after she did this, I finally looked at her. I must have been out of my early 20s or something. I'm like, Grandma, why did you take me? Like, why did you take me? She's like, well, you really wanted to go. And it was fun. And I'm like, it was fun? She's like, well, no, I didn't know what was going on, but you were having fun. And that was fun. And it was fun that we did it together. It didn't matter that she didn't understand the language. She didn't understand who the characters were. It didn't matter. None of that mattered. What mattered is there was something that we were doing together. What mattered is my grandma took me because she loved me. And she was willing to sit through it because she loved me. And because she loved me, she didn't just have to sit through it. She found a way to enjoy my enjoyment. That's what love does. Jesus came basically to teach us that. Jesus came into a world that was obsessed with outward signs and showing things, and are you doing this right or that right, that had gotten themselves obsessed with checklists. As long as you do all the do's and don't do all the don'ts, you're fine. And Jesus came to teach us something incredibly simple and incredibly basic. At the end of the day, it's not really about all those outward signs. It's about something inside. It's about the love that you have and the love that you share. And so if we want to be like Jesus, if we want to practice the religion of Jesus, The religion of Jesus is simple. He told us many times. The religion of Jesus is love God, love neighbor, and love yourself. And Jesus makes sure that we always have what we want, need, and we always have it in abundance. That there's room at Jesus' table for us, no matter who we are, or where we've been, or what we've done. And the only thing he asks from us is to accept the love that he offers and share it with others. And when we do that, when we are in the business, when we are in the business about sharing love, it doesn't matter if the songs are in Portuguese. It doesn't matter if you don't know who Optimus Prime is. Shudder. But if you are hanging out and being with and sharing the love and grace and peace that you know with those who God has placed around you, then we are practicing the religion of Jesus, the way that he taught us and wants us to practice it. There is room at Christ's table. There should be room at our table too, for any and all we may be put in our path. Amen.